Bonjour, je suis désolé, mais je ne parle pas français. Je l'ai étudié dans l'école, mais maintenant je suis vieux, donc anglais. So this talk is on the general question of postcolonialism in games. Over this talk, what we're going to do is identify colonial mechanics in various games, hypothesize alternative mechanics, and identify common patterns amongst all of these interventions, right? So firstly, why postcolonialism? I mean, firstly, postcolonialism is just correct. Like, there's a lot of colonial ideology that's still around in a lot of the things we say, the games we play, stuff like that. So it's been very rewarding for me personally to work on Syphilisation, my post-colonial Forex game, because it allows me to make a game that's much more in line with what I personally believe, which it just feels good when you're making a game that's aligned with what you yourself feel. The other thing is that post-colonialism is very open. The nature of the industry pushes against post-colonialism, so any work you do in this space, there are very few people in it. So it gives you a lot of clean, open space to play with. Sorry about this. So why general questions? From the specific, we can create a general formula. We can take any individual intervention, and by putting a few of them together, we can come up with a general practice that we can use to decolonize any game or any space in general, right? We don't need to keep reinventing the wheel, and we can set down foundations that we can later build upon, right? So we're going to start with Syphilisation, like the poster child of neoliberal game design, right? Syphilisation in particular has two colonial pillars that I want to address. The first is it sees history as the clash of empires, right? It's the Americans versus the Soviets, the English versus the French, right? Christianity versus Islam, whatever. Now that's a very powerful way of looking at history. I'm sorry, my slides are gone? Yeah. So that's a very powerful way of looking at history, but it's not the only way. Right? If instead we view history as like the cooperative endeavor to make the world a better place, that's an equally valid way of looking at history, and that's one that makes for very different games. The second is that Syphilisation is very strongly based on the idea of growth for the sake of growth, right? You're always producing more, making more money, producing more science, and we are living in a time right now where we're seeing these checks become cashed. Right? There are limits to unsustainable growth. There are limits to the kind of capitalist, ever-increasing returns. And we're living in a time right now where we can see those limits come through, but our games don't reflect that. Right? And really, to put it succinctly, right? Syphilisation lets you play anyone you want, as long as that's America. Right? So the first thing I did with Syphilisation is I put in cooperative win conditions, right? You're no longer empires fighting each other, you're just a bunch of students doing a group report. And that very simple change fundamentally changes the gameplay. Two of the big outstanding problems in Forex games are those of ICS, or Infinite City Sprawl, and Wars of Opportunity. And by making the game cooperative instead of competitive, both of those problems disappear. I'm no longer trying to settle every open space. I'm no longer trying to take over every open city. Instead, I say, you know what, let the other people doing this group report do some of the work themselves, right? Why am I taking over all of the space and putting all of the work on my own shoulders? And of course, as anyone who's ever done a group project knows, there's still lots of conflict in group projects, right? It's not like suddenly conflict disappears. But the way it's framed changes, the way you engage in it changes, and also it just reduces the stakes, right? It's a much quieter, much more low-stakes story, and that gives you a lot of space to put in quieter, more low-stakes statements that you just don't get with the big, bombastic clash of empires narratives. Another big change is pollution and climate change. Right? This tends to be abstracted away quite strongly by by games like Syphilisation. In Syphilisation, all production causes pollution, right? All conflict causes pollution as well, right? There are vast tracts of land right now that have been rendered completely uninhabitable because of past conflict, right? Also, climate change is game ending. In the Syphilisation expansion pack, where they brought in climate change, one of the things they had in their promo was, are you going to work against climate change, or are you going to take advantage of the opportunities that climate change is going to give you? Are you going to use new shipping canals? And this is a crazy way to think, right? Like, none of us want climate change so that we can send goods ships through the Arctic, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. And this comes from something that's core to 4X games in particular, which is Sid Meier's famous statement: a game is a series of interesting decisions, right? But what that means is, what that doesn't have to mean is we make whether or not you want to have climate change an interesting decision, right? This is not an interesting decision, right? It's a question with a very simple answer. The interesting decisions are more on the lines of, how can we continue to live without having climate change be inevitable, right? And Syphilisation is a group report. So what I did was I used pollution as a parallel for the toxicity within the group, because we've all been in groups that have just kind of fallen apart because everybody's just so unhappy with everyone else, right? And by doing this, one of the things I wanted to highlight was we have much lower standards for nation states than we do for individuals. If an individual was as acquisitive, as toxic, as like dangerous as a nation state, we would consider that person to be a terrible person. But for some reason, we let it go when it's nation states. Another thing is that Syphilisation has very autonomous citizens. These are citizens with desires and citizens who solve their own problems, right? I view government as needing the consent of the governed, right? Which a game like Syphilisation just abstracts away, right? From here, we're going to go to Breath of the Wild. Now, I'm going to start with the idea of Rudyard Kipling's Kim as an open world game. Right? It has the same kind of adventuring from place to place, and it has the same treatment of a world as a game space, right? Kim is set in the Great Game, the machinations of the British and the Russians for India, right? And this treatment of a world as a game space abstracts away the people who live in this world, right? The second thing I'm going to push it back against is amusement parks. In Breath of the Wild, there are a lot of places which kind of just spin up when you come and then spin down when you go. You know, the world stops moving when you close your eyes. And this comes, I mean, we were all there for when World of Warcraft came out and how that changed game design. But you know, it's been a while since World of Warcraft. It's been a while since that era. Maybe we can have more complicated game worlds than this. So I'm going to talk about the world of Breath of the Wild. I'm just going to highlight some key points. The first thing is that Link only saves the world. He doesn't live in the world. You get a house in both games, and you never live in the house. There's just no reason to ever spend time in the house because you don't live in this world. You come, you save the world, you leave the world, right? There's no inhabiting as part of this. And one of my favorite things about Breath of the Wild was actually the Terrytown quest. So it's a much more low-stakes thing. It's just a bunch of people who all are joined by a common surname, right? And you just go through this quest line and you leave something behind in a way that you don't with the rest of the more bombastic, free the divine beast, defeat Ganondorf narrative. The second thing is complicate the world, right? One of the best moments for me in Breath of the Wild was when I first saw a dragon, because I didn't know they were there, and then suddenly the dragon exists, and the game world is just so much more magical as a result of that. But then, you know, 30 hours later, I'm farming dragons for teeth, right? So what was once a magical creature is now a renewable resource generator, right? So that cheapens the world. You know, let some secrets in your game remain secrets over the course of the game. Don't just make everything bottom line oriented. And finally, respect the world. You know, it's a beautiful world, but the game doesn't really let you recognize that, right? It's nice to be, one of the fundamental human activities is like leaving little piles of stones in places that you find beautiful, right? Imagine if you could do that in Breath of the Wild. Imagine how that changes how you interact with the world. Because so often I'm on top of a hill or I'm at a tower or something, and it's gorgeous. And then, you know, I just jump to find the next Korok seed, right? There's no, letting players have a beat to actually admire how beautiful the worlds you give them are, that changes their relationship with the world. Also, it's nice to have rituals, you know, like you're harvesting so much from the world, you're damaging so much in the world. Just allow players to recognize what they have done to change the world that they're in. So one of the most interesting things for me is that blockbuster games just do not have personal growth. Blockbuster movies tend to be around a personal flaw of the character that gets resolved over the course of the movie. But in a game, that's just not the thing. You're the same person at the end of the game as you were at the start, right? Imagine if you tied your mechanical growth to personal growth, right? It's just such an easy dovetail that we just don't explore. The other big thing is that the revolution cannot be a single individual. When we talk about the Indian independence movement, when we talk about the American civil rights movement, we tend to talk a lot about, let's say, Gandhi or MLK, right? Individuals. But these people only mattered because of the followings behind them. If you read accounts of people of more everyday people in the Indian independence movement, they'll often never have seen Gandhi. They may have heard him on the radio. But they're as much a part of, there is no movement without these people. So why do our stories abstract these people away? Some quick B-sides. Princess Mononoke is a good way to, it's a good place to look if you're a little unsure about how you want to have a cooperative narrative in a, like, save the world narrative, how you want to bring these two together. When you lower the stakes, it lets you say much more personal stories. When you're busy saving the world, it's hard to really have space for something a little more intimate. Sid Meier's Pirates has The Living World. That's a good place to look. And Sable is a very different take on a post-colonial open world than all of this, right? It comes at it from a very different angle. And there are many angles to post-colonialism, right? So it's good to get a diverse view. From here, I'm going to go to Stardew Valley because I want to highlight that cozy is not the same as post-colonial, right? These are entirely different things. Stardew Valley is a homesteading game, and we can move that to a community-based game. An actual farm community has communal events, right? There are harvest festivals where everybody needs to work together to get the harvest in before it spoils. And there are things like barn building, where the entire community comes together to put up a building. Right? Stardew Valley is very individualistic, and this is a good space to put in a post-colonial intervention, right? And then sustainable harvesting, the idea of spoilage, Stardew Valley abstracts that away into a bin where you can just dump everything and have it sell. But that's not how it works, right? You have to produce things that have to get used. If they don't get used, they spoil. Just having a little more complexity to what it means to make something really changes the way you interact with it. And going against gardening, right? In Stardew Valley, you want a thing, you put it down, right? Have a little more back and forth with the actual world that you're building in, right? The other thing is leisure activities. You know, you quit your soul-crushing job to go live on the farm, and then you spend 20 hours a day doing farm work, right? You never read, you never just sit and watch the lake, right? And you never go on dates. You just give people stuff, right? Like, did you quit your job just to go farm all day? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the rotten core of cottagecore. It's the two most popular spouses in Stardew Valley are Abigail and Penny, right? Who are both good characters, but are also both cute girls who need a strong man, right? And the nature of the game pushes you towards this kind of narrative, right? If there was space for more back and forth with the people you're talking to, then you would see your players push towards different kinds of stories as well. The other thing is, you have the office job. It crushes your soul. You go live on the farm, right? What about everybody else who had the office job? Is your revolution just for you as an individual, or are you going to take people along with you? Right? Now I'm going to go to Monster Hunter because I want to emphasize that post-colonial is not the same as nonviolent, right? Hunting has a history. Hunting has a much longer history than post-colonialism, right? So the first thing here is I want to actually talk about how cleanly it fits into Monster Hunter already. Monster Hunter has monsters that have lore, they have personality, and most interestingly of all, they have pathetic moments, right? They have the moment where you've taken out 80% of their health and they start running away, they're missing a wing, they're missing a leg, and they're just limping away as fast as you can. That's a fascinating complication to put into a game that's largely about loot, about having numbers go up. And yet, this is in the game, and this is such a powerful moment every time because it makes you see the monster as a creature, as something that lives, and not just as a video game mechanic. Two keys to respectful hunting are that of clean kills and fair chase, right? Fair chase means that the quarry needs to have a chance, and Monster Hunter has some of this because, you can always get killed by the monster. But then as the game progresses and as you're basically grinding monsters that are well beneath you, right, that are too easy, the concept of fair chase gets lost. And this is where a complication of clean kills would be very strong, right? Trying to kill the monster with the minimum of suffering to the monster. That's a good way to allow the player to showcase mastery that the game doesn't really have right now. Then again, rituals. There's a bit at the end of each hunt where a little cinematic plays and you either fall on the grass or your cat friend capers around you or something like that. This is a great space to just put in some respect for the monster that you have felled, right? Rituals are a key point of hunting ceremonies across cultures where you take a moment to respect the creature that you have fought. Right? Then using the whole animal, it's kind of, these are gigantic creatures, and then at the end of the hunt, you have like 3 bones and a piece of skin, and you only need the 1 bone, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. That detracts from the fantasy of hunting these creatures anyway. So it's a good space to just think a bit more about what you would do with the animal as a whole. How would this village work with these animals as a whole? And finally, just consider the ecosystem a little bit. Instead of hunting the same things over and over, think about what that would do to the ecosystem, and that encourages players to have a little variety in what they hunt instead of repeating the same challenge over and over, right? And it also lets players connect a little bit more to the environment. If you're hunting an invasive species, that feels different. That feels like you're actually making some progress in a way that Monster Hunter just kind of feels like the repetitive grind. Then the village of Monster Hunter, it's a very interesting place because I don't know what a village like that would be, where it's so oriented around hunting these gigantic monsters that keep coming. But really, in the game, it's just a quest hub. You go there, you pick up your next quest, you do a few, get some new armor or whatever, on to the next cycle, right? Such a village would have farmers, gatherers, and artisans, right? They would have people who can use the parts of the monster that you are not using. They have people who could give you requests for parts that they need, and who in turn could fill the requests for things that you need as they go about their own days. Right? So we've gone over 4 games. We've gone over a number of interventions. Right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to abstract that out into general practices that you can use. Right? The first thing is history from below instead of history from above. So that's things like the camps in Syphilisation, that's things like equal villagers in Monster Hunter and Stardew Valley, and that's things like popular freedom movements in Breath of the Wild, right? Treat history as a a popular thing, as something rising up from the people as a mass instead of as the actions of a few individuals. Secondly, cooperation, that's the group report in Syphilisation, group actions in Stardew Valley, environmentalisms in Monster Hunter, right? Just again, the game doesn't just have to be the player. Allow for some cooperation as well. Connect the ends to the means. So here I'm going to give you an anecdote from Gandhi. He talks about a moment where he imagines someone who wants the watch of their friend. Right now, there are 3 ways to get this watch, he says. You can ask for the watch as a gift, you can buy the watch from your friend, or you can take the watch by force. And the thing is, with each of these 3 ways, the watch itself changes. You know, if you get it as a gift, then that's what it represents. If you buy it, then it represents that. It represents the transaction. And if you take it by force, it represents the death of your friendship, right? Games as a whole, they struggle with this. We tend to be very bottom line oriented. But the ends are difficult to divorce from the means, just across whatever we do. Then quiet the core fantasy. You know, it's just nice to have a little space where it's not so loud, not so bombastic. You know, we don't only watch Fast and Furious movies, right? We like to have a little bit of, we like to change things up a bit every now and again. And it doesn't hurt to do the same thing in games. So these are some quick complications, you know, just small ways small direct things that you can do if you're looking to change your game up a bit. Pollution mechanics are a great place to start, from production in Syphilisation, from waste in Monster Hunter and Stardew Valley, from conflict in Breath of the Wild. It just changes the way people engage with materials, right? It complicates it, and forcing them to deal with pollution makes them think more about efficiency and about waste. Have unclassifiable elements. Those are the dragons and secrets in Breath of the Wild. It can be humanity and religion in Syphilisation. And it can be animal behaviors in Monster Hunter. You know, one time I was walking in Bangalore, and a stray dog just decided to follow me for 1.5 kilometers, right? I don't know why, you know, like dogs do weird things, right? They just do. Everybody who has a dog knows that dogs do weird things. And this is why monsters in Monster Hunter kind of feel eggshell thin in a way, right? Because they don't do weird things. They're in the same place doing the same thing every time. In the real world, creatures just do weird things. Right? Have worlds, not just game boards. Right? If the entirety of the world is just axes of influence, then again, you've abstracted away much of what makes a world, right? Much of what makes it important is the people who are in it. You can't just abstract that away. And then against determinism, right? One of the things about Syphilisation is it has a very deterministic tech tree that treats, it's a very end of history way of looking at it, that no matter what you do, you're going to end up where you are now, right? That's not true. There are better futures, there are better presents that could be, right? This is where a non-deterministic tech tree can really make a difference, and this is where monsters out of their habitats can make a difference as well. Leave spaces for meditation, right? Again, it reframes the way a person engages with the world, if they have a little space to just respect beauty there. Have ecosystems, don't just let people hunt and farm unsustainably. And have permanent unfixable damage, whether that's climate change in Syphilisation, extinction in Monster Hunter and Stardew Valley, or a salted land in Breath of the Wild. So this has been a mechanical talk, but I just want to go over some narrative stuff very quickly. It's helpful to have subaltern characters. It's helpful to have autonomy outside the player, not just the player's actions. Never have savages. There's just no reason ever to have a savage. It's just outdated. And finally, don't ignore the revolution. You know, if the material conditions of your game world are such that a revolution would be inevitable, but you don't show that revolution, then your game world is shallow, right? You need to actually follow things to their conclusions. So now I'm going to have a quick note on ideology in general, right? This talk has been post-colonial oriented, but this can be abstracted to any ideology. The first thing is that having an ideology in mind provides you with both direction and approach when you're solving game design issues. Too often we know that something is wrong with our game, but the space of possible ways to fix it is just huge. So that becomes a problem. How do I choose which of the 15 solutions I want to go with? If you have an ideology in mind, that provides you both a direction with which to solve your problems and an approach pretty much for free. And it also ensures consistency, right? If you're solving 3 different problems with the same ideology, your 3 solutions will naturally converge in a way they might not if you treat them as 3 separate problems. Secondly, it provides differences for meaningful reasons. This is something that your players and the press even can actually latch onto. If you're saying I'm making a first-person shooter, but everyone is a bunny rabbit, like that's a difference, but it's hard to really attach onto that. It's just okay, right? If you're saying I'm making a first-person shooter that represents atheism, then that's an ideal that lets people attach a little bit more onto it. It lets your difference feel a little more meaningful than if it's just a difference for the sake of being different. And finally, ideology can simply be a complementary tool. You don't need to go all the way. You don't need to go through every single mechanic of the game and see whether it fits with your ideology or not. You can just use it as something in your back pocket to take out when you're stuck and just find some new approaches to solving your problems. 2 important points just to think about after this. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I built Syphilisation, a post-colonial 4X game. And important to me was that it remains very recognizably a 4X game. But that means that there are compromises I have to make with the ideology. I have the same hex tiles that Civ 6 does, even though I don't agree with that as a representation of space, right? I don't believe in the very fixed hexes that cannot change over the course of history. But if I want to make a 4X game, I do need to compromise with the players who are coming in. I needed to make something that was very recognizably a 4X game to keep people from immediately backfiring out of the game. And that's where you have to accept that the forms of the genre that you work in have limitations, no matter how much you want to push against them. If you're going to play in the genre, you will never fully dismantle the genre that you're trying to push against. And secondly, the game designer is also authority. The game designer is, in fact, a very strong authority. If your game is anti-authoritarian, you're coming up against the fact that players treat the game's rules as very close to unviable, right? Unviolable. In that, if I'm losing at Magic the Gathering, I cannot say that now I should be allowed to play 2 land cards every turn. That's just not acceptable. I have to figure out a way within very fixed rules. This authority is something that players assume going into a game. They find it hard to question the fundamentals of mechanics. And if you're making something anti-authoritarian, you need to put in things that help your players question your own authority as well. Right, that's my talk. These are my details. You can play Syphilisation on Steam and on itch if you're interested in seeing how these things play out in practice. Yeah. Any questions?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was really looking forward to it. You very briefly mentioned Sable, and I was curious to hear you speak more about how it's related to this topic, mostly because I want more people to know about and play Sable.
So I'm gonna be honest. I played Sable like pretty much as it launched, and I couldn't get too far because of the bugs. So yeah, I have to get back to it at some point. But pretty much, so Sable, one of the important things it does though is it says we can have an open world game without conflict, right? Which is. Conflict is so key to games as a whole because of the history of games, right? We've abstracted it down into a series of mechanics that are very easy to reproduce. Sable, by pushing against that, says how much of this is necessary. The second thing is Sable really leans hard into its narrative, right? Meghna is a narrative designer first and foremost. And I'm personally a mechanical designer. I personally work in the numbers. So the way I came from it is very different. The other thing I want to point out is that my postcolonialism really comes from an Indian independence background. And that is obviously not the only postcolonialism, right? So mine is very influenced by Gandhi and by Ahimsa, but every independence movement has its own little has its own flavor, right? So coming from different ones will lead to very different games. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't have more to say about Sable itself. Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you for the talk. Yes, I'm here. Yes. So you were talking about the fact that in today's video games, the words stop to live when we close our eyes. Do you think, well, that's a sensitive subject, but do you think that in a way artificial intelligence could help designers to make more organical words, like for example the behavior of NPCs in a game? And I know that I think that was NVIDIA unveiled a demo where NPCs had a life, they had their own behavior, and so.
So I think we do always have to compromise, right? We have to compromise with the material conditions of like what people play with, right? If we can't like infinitely simulate everything and so on. But fundamentally, you know, like video game design is cheating, right? We're all cheating all the time. We're all pretending to do things that we don't actually do. I think here, if we just put a few more gestures in, you know, just let people believe that the world is there, whether or not, no matter how much we actually do, it gives players a lot more. It just gives players a lot more space, because we're constantly fighting the numbers of a game, right? We're constantly fighting the tendency of players to optimize and optimize and optimize all the fun out of the game, right? Just all of these things that we do to take the player away from the numbers, we don't have to do a lot, we just have to gesture at it, and it makes a huge difference to the players. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you very much. It was super interesting. And I had a question about if you had any thoughts on the use of money in games. In particular, I know I was talking to the designer of Snowtopia a while back, and when he explained that he didn't have money in his game, but he had found a different way to handle that, I was totally, like, blew my mind. I hadn't even thought that was a thing you could you could do. And it made me think, since then I've been thinking about that, and like, you know, what do you think? Does using money in games create a certain kind of capitalist or maybe even post-colonial framing by itself, or is that just kind of a detail that?
So, I mean, yes, in the most basic way, it does push towards colonial thinking, because it kind of flattens everything into a very hard number. You know, this is worth 3 gold, that is worth 5 gold. 5 gold is 2 gold more than 3 gold, no matter what you do, right? It's very hard, and it's very... I spoke a bit about how the ends need to be connected to the means, right? If you have money, it becomes very easy to divorce the ends from the means. This made me 50 gold, that made me 50 gold. They are equivalent, right? Having said that, like, as I said, you know, we're always compromising when we do these things. We're not hard ideology. So just because a game has money, that doesn't immediately make it like irredeemably colonial. You know, it's just a factor to consider. Another thing that is worth looking at is in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. He has a person who goes trading from settlement to settlement, but every time he trades, they bargain with each other. but they both bargain to give the other person more, right? Because they both understand that like they have needs, but everybody else has needs. So they're trying to bargain to get as little for themselves as possible so that somebody else gets more of what they could use, right? We have space for all of these things. I mean, one of the big things about trading games is that they kind of break after a point because they're so bottom line oriented that the economy breaks, right? Money in itself is only important for what it can do, right? But in games, we often treat money as the goal in itself, right? So there's a lot of play with money that we don't really use fully. Does that answer your question?
Hello, here. Thank you for that rich talk. You mentioned that in your game you implemented climate change, and it is not an usual constraint for most of the players. So how did you manage to make them deal with it in the most pleasant way, and I mean difficulty-wise?
Climate change.
Yep.
So actually, you know, climate change has been around in the 4X games pretty much since inception, right? Civilization 2, Civilization 2 is the civilization I grew up with. You know, that's the one I most identify with. And there, you know, you would see climate change just devastate like massive areas, right? Alpha Centauri has the same thing. But I think the bigger thing is that players kind of like the idea of growth for the sake of growth, right? Players kind of like seeing numbers just go up and go up and go up. The thing to do here is to change the decision from how do I make the number go up to how do I make the number go up sustainably. And that can be more interesting. A very good parallel is in wars in 4X games. Right? Players love to win wars. Players do not want to lose wars, right? But if every war was just the player winning at like 200 to 1 odds or whatever, then that would not be fun for the player, right? In the same way, you have growth mechanics where you encourage the player to grow sustainably instead of growing unsustainably. And you encourage the player to just like think about whether or not they want to just grow at this point or whether they want to do something quieter. A lot of it is just giving players alternatives. You know, something like Civ, it really doesn't give you an alternative to growth for the sake of growth. The numbers of the buildings keep getting bigger, the numbers of the requirements keep getting bigger, and there's no alternative ways to play. Civilization gives you options. It gives you other ways to solve things besides just infinite growth. And that automatically lets players understand what's going on. Do you need me to say more?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very much needed. I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about games that engage in colonial and capitalist gameplay, but try to criticize it and raise awareness to it.
So, you know, I think an important thing with all of these is, and especially with this, is that we should try to, none of us are going to solve this alone. You know, this talk isn't going to solve colonialism in game development. You know, my game isn't going to solve colonialism outright, right? So what I try to do is I try to be very generous. You know, people come from different angles. People have their own different approaches to postcolonialism. A lot of people are narrative designers. And for them, that is the lens through which they try to push back against the colonialism of the industry. I support that. You know, I support everybody who's pushing back against these things, no matter how they do it. My way happens to be mechanical. You know, other people have different ways. I'm just glad whenever I see somebody pushing back against the shared problem.
Thank you for the talk. It was amazing. You spoke about revolution and the fact that revolution is not made by one man alone, but with thousands of men and people. How do you have some pointer of how to balance the fact that people do have agency to work toward revolution in a game, but not make that it is the only factor of the success or not of the revolution. Like to balance the fact that it is a group movement and the fact that each person is important and need to act.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
Do you have some pointer to balance the fact that we need to describe the revolution as a group movement, but also that each individual and the player need to be active and need to do something and have agency? Yeah,
no, this is the big problem. This is a tough problem because like players want to be the center. Not only do players want to be the center of the story, we want to make them the center of the story, right? We're all used to this. I think, again, you don't have to go all the way. You know, you can if you want. If you want to make the story of an individual, then you can do that. But if you feel like you would rather have the story of the central person, right, then you can do that. All you have to do is just gesture at it, right? Like game designers are cheaters. We cheat all the time. We cheat with everything. You don't have to actually like model out every single person with their desires and what they want to do. You just have to tell the player that it's not just them, right? Just show them that other people are doing things at the same time. I also very briefly would like to recommend this book called The Last Heroes by P. Sainath, where what he did was he said the last of India's freedom fighters are dying out, right? India gained independence 75 years ago, so it's fading out of living memory. So he interviewed a number of individuals, a number of very common people who participated in the freedom movement, right? And when you read their stories, you get a sense of how much space we don't cover at all in the games that we make, right?
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for a very good and interesting talk. I love mechanics and all we can do with mechanics. But I think that there is, for somebody like me who doesn't really know what post-colonialism is about, it would be really interesting to just give your like synthetic definition of what it is and what it isn't.
This is the thing. It's hard to really... I tried to stick to concrete stuff in this talk because it is hard with these definitions. They grow and they shrink depending on who's talking and who wants to do it. So in the talk, I talk about things like, you know, growth for the sake of growth mechanics, like history as the clash of empires, right? Are you asking for like how you can see if something is colonial versus not colonial, just as a general thing, or?
I think the whole concept of colonial often gets mixed in with a lot of other things that are not necessarily colonial, but are effects of our modern society. And so I think it can be complicated to mix these, whereas, you know, if you have a specific message about the oppression of people, for example, and mixing that with some general points about capitalism. And I think that makes it muddled often.
Well, the thing is, though, that it's hard to isolate anything. You know, the Industrial Revolution was in large part a function of colonialism, right? To create the textile factories, it required two things. It required both an abundant source of raw material and a market with where to ship the finished goods, right? And this required the destruction of indigenous Indian textile manufacturers. You cannot talk about capitalism, especially as it's currently understood, without talking about colonialism, because they were both in a cycle with each other, right? The colonialism allowed the capitalism to develop. That allowed further colonialism, right? From the textile economy, we get the steel economy, all of this. So, I mean, and then on top of that, we also get a lot of just the way we think, right? The British in India wrote Indian histories that viewed India as going from Hindu to Muslim to British, right? Because for them, they wanted to put themselves in the spot of the Mughals who were their predecessors, right? So you see a lot of the ceremonies they did also explicitly evoked Mughal ceremonies because they wanted to have the Indians have that idea. And that's why these talks, this thinking will always be tied in with other things, right? Indian postcolonialism is tied in with ahimsa, right? With nonviolence, which goes back maybe 4,000 years, right? Maybe 3,000 years, depending where you count. So I think with all of these, it's important. I think we have to just be generous. You know, we have to say, that might not be how I define postcolonialism, but I see where they're coming from, right? I feel like this talk is more nonviolent than it is postcolonial, but I see where he's coming from. That's all I can do. Okay, thank you so much.